So now at this point, we added a bunch of new components. And all these components have their CSS files, but all those files are empty. Because at the moment, all these styles are in that styles.css file for simplicity reasons. But this styles.css file has one potential disadvantage. All the styles defined in there are global, which means they affect all components, the entire website, which sometimes, of course, can also be an advantage, but often you want to scope your styles to your components to avoid accidental style clashes. And therefore, what we might want to do here, and what you typically want to do in your Angular projects, is that you want to put the styles that belong to a component into the style file of that component. Because any CSS styles that go into such a component-specific style file, by default, will be scoped to that component by Angular. So they will be restricted to that component and can't accidentally affect other components or any other markup anywhere else on the page. So for example, we can grab this header rule here, this header selector, this rule, and also all the other header related rules, which are all these rules up to including this media query, and cut it from the styles.css file and add it to the header.component CSS file. Now you must make sure that this header component CSS file then is referenced by the header component TypeScript file and the class there, which is the case here, otherwise it would be ignored. But with that, if you save that, with those styles removed from the styles CSS file and added here to the header component CSS file, you'll see that the application looks just the way it did before, but now we have this better structure, this better approach, where we have the styles in the component style file. And we now might want to migrate all those styles to their respective components, but since this is some annoying work, I did it for you. And attached, you therefore find new style files for the control.component CSS file and for those other components as well. So you should use these attached CSS files and replace your component CSS files with them. And in addition, you also find an updated styles.css file attached, and then replace your styles.css file with the attached one. For those styles to work, you should also make sure that in the server status component HTML file, you also add an ID of status to that div. And once you then completed this migration and you revisit your page, you'll notice that some things look broken here. Most importantly, the button, but also those inputs. And that's not a mistake. Instead, I did indeed change some styles so that they at the moment won't work anymore, because we'll soon adjust the application to make them work again. But for example, here in the control component CSS file, I actually added this control class selector here in my CSS rules, and I'm then looking for labels and inputs and text areas inside of elements with the control class, and at the moment this class isn't used anywhere. And similarly, in the button component CSS file, I'm looking for a button element, but there is no button element in here, in this template. There only are spans in there. So these styles also break, because now these styles are scoped to their components. And if I have some buttons somewhere else in my application, that rule here won't change it, because like all the other CSS code in here, it is scoped to this component and this template. And here in this template, we have no button element. So that's why some styles are failing, but we'll now take care of that and along the way dive into some new Angular concepts and features. Now I want to dive into additional Angular features about which you should know by fixing this control component. In the control component CSS file, I'm looking for the control class on elements, and then I'm trying to style labels, inputs, and text areas that are nested inside of an element with the class control. Well, therefore, what we could and should do to fix this broken look of this form is we should go to the control component HTML file, and there on the paragraph, we can add this control class. With that, if we do that, it's fixed to some extent. The label looks better now, which is a start. But the input and text area isn't looking the way it should look. It doesn't look horrible, but it doesn't have the look it should have. And why is that the case? After all, we have this rule here, right? Well, yes, but with this CSS rule, we're trying to style inputs and text areas that are inside of an element with the class control on it. And you might say that's the case here because we project inputs and text areas here in place of this ng-content element, and therefore they will be inside of an element with a class of control. So these styles here should become active on them, right? Yeah, almost. The problem is Angular does not care about which content might eventually end up in your component's template. It only cares about what it sees in your component template. And there it just sees a placeholder, not the actual inputs or text areas that will end up here in the future. And that's why these styles won't affect the inputs and text areas that will be projected into this paragraph and into this component. So what can we do about that? Well, you can disable the scoping of these styles here, for example. Because by default, as I explained, component styles are scoped to the component to which they belong. They can't affect anything else anywhere in any other component. But here I actually wanna have these styles affect inputs and text areas that are somewhere else in the application. And therefore, what we should do here, or what we could do to fix this problem, is go to the component selector of the control component and add a new setting here. And the new setting you want to add is the encapsulation setting. And encapsulation takes a value of type view encapsulation. And that is actually a so-called enum, which is essentially a collection of possible values. It's a TypeScript feature which is used by Angular here. You can and should import view encapsulation from Angular core. And then by adding a dot here, you can access the different values you can use. Now, emulated would be the default, and you don't need to set it. Emulated means that Angular emulates the shadow DOM behavior, which is a browser thing, which in the end means that styles that belong to a component or to an element should be scoped to that element. The shadow DOM is not a TypeScript or Angular specific feature. Instead, it's a browser feature, because in the browser you can also build custom HTML elements totally without Angular. And Angular emulates that browser feature for its own components. Alternatively, you could choose Shadow DOM so that Angular under the hood uses the real browser Shadow DOM feature, which is not supported by all browsers though, which is why emulated is the default. But here we need none, which simply disables that style scoping, that style encapsulation, as Angular calls it. With that setting added here to this control component, The styles set up here will again become global styles. And therefore now they will affect the input and text area that is eventually rendered into this component. And that's therefore another important feature to know. You will typically not need to disable encapsulation that often, but if you do need to, like here in this example, this is how you can do it.